welcome back. We're going to start with the final talk of the day. Pretty exciting. If you're in the other room, make your way through, grab a seat, and yeah.
Thank you guys, you have been filling out the Slido. It's so interesting to see what defines each of you. Physical body, age, roles I adopt, interests, works, family. Well, identity is the question of this evening. We're going to hear a talk from Michael as he delves into where we should be looking for identity, and then afterwards giving you guys a chance to ask any questions you have and hear more about the Christian faith.
In case you weren't here for the other talk we just had, I'm Matthew, and this is...
I'm Sam.
And we're with the Christian Union. We'd just like to once again thank you, those that were part of preparing all that lovely food for the International Cafe. And if you weren't here for that, then it's on at 6 o'clock tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after. You don't want to miss it.
Good bit of maths there. Well, I'm about to invite Michael up. Matthew's going to... Sorry, that was patronising, wasn't it? So don't worry. We all know maths well, don't you worry. But Michael, would you like to take my mic and Matthew will introduce you?
It's done me dirty there. Alright. So the topic of this evening is identity. And Michael, why don't you just introduce us? Introduce yourself. What makes up your identity?
Wow, what makes my identity? Quite a few things. So I'm Michael Otts. The name is a bit of a clue. Otts comes from Estonia, that's where my father's side of the family come from, so I'm half, quarter, or some percentage Estonian, depending on how you work it out. Born in Leicester, not far from here, married to Rebecca. I have 5 siblings and 15 nieces and nephews. I'm 40 years old. No, I don't look it. Right? Okay, no, I do. Yeah. And anything else? And I get to do things like this, speak at events organised by Christian student groups, both here in the UK and in other parts of Europe.
Brilliant. So now we know a little bit more about you, but have you ever had your identity mistaken for someone else?
Yeah, the one person apparently that people mistake me for, well, I don't think they've actually mistaken me for, but they say you look a bit like, is Bear Grylls, which is quite cool because I quite like Bear Grylls, so I'll take that. I don't think that's a bad thing.
And final question before I let you do your talk. Have you ever had your identity stolen?
I actually have. A few years ago, I was renting out my flat on Airbnb because I travel so much. I was like, I can earn money for not living at home. And it was going really well for about a year until one person took it for about a month, and they used their month in my flat to basically steal my identity. And I came back to my flat to discover a large pile of posts, all addressed to me, informing me about all the bank accounts that I'd opened, and all the mobile phones that I'd taken out contracts with, and so on. It's a little bit stressful when you come back. Now thankfully, in the end, it was all sorted, and I didn't lose any money or my credit rating. But it was really funny because I phoned up one of the banks to start with. Ironically, a bank that already I banked with. They, like, how bad is that? Like, I'm already there, and they open another account, and they say, "Can I help you?" And I say, "Well, someone stole my identity. They've opened an account in my name." And they say, "Okay, well, we'll need to take some questions for security." I said, "Well, why are you doing that?" "Well, we need to check that you're the person that opened the accounts." I was like, "But I am not the person that opened the accounts." And they're like, "Okay, what's your memorable word?" I'm like, "Well, I can tell you what mine is, but it's probably not the one of the person who fraudulently opened the account." So yes, they weren't very good, I have to say. But thankfully, all sorted in the end.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I look forward to hearing what you say. So, leave it to you.
Great, fantastic. Well, wonderful to be here, isn't it? Well done to the Christian Union for putting on this evening, and hope that you've enjoyed the events of the day, those of you that have been around for a number of them. But tonight we're looking at this question of identity. How do I discover my true identity? And as we said, the Slido is open throughout, so be on your phones, go to 194972, that's the code for slido.com, and you'll find the question page is there. And so any questions off the back of anything I say tonight, please do feel free to ask them. And we will look at those a little bit later on. But tonight we're thinking about identity. I heard the story a few years ago of a couple of guys who came out of a pub late one night and they were a little bit drunk. And they were walking down the road, got a bit lost, and they stumbled into a very smart, uniformed naval officer. And one of the drunk guys looks at this guy and they say, "Oh, mate, do you know where we are?" And this guy was a bit offended by the way that they were speaking to him, and so he straightened up and looked down his nose at them and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And then the other drunk guy said, "Now we're really in trouble because we don't know where we are and he doesn't know who he is." But that is the question that we're thinking about tonight. Who am I? What is my identity? And that's an important question to ask at any point, but it's a particularly important question to ask maybe at this point in your lives. You've come away from home, maybe from a different culture, different country for some of you. And the question is, who am I? Suddenly you've got the freedom to discover potentially who you really are. Or the opportunity to create an identity for yourself. Who are you? But actually, who knows who you really are? Do your parents, your friends back home, well, they knew who you used to be, but maybe you don't like who you used to be and you want to be someone else. Is it your housemates and your course mates and the people that you've chosen to hang out with at uni? Well, they know who you are now, but do they really know who you are if they've only known you for a few weeks, maybe, or a few months? And then sometimes we have to ask, do we really know ourselves? Do we really know who we are? How do we answer that question? Well, the way we answer that question, I would suggest, depends on which culture we live in and also which generation of history we come from. Because some previous generations of our own culture, and still today many cultures around the world, would answer the question of our identity by saying, to discover your identity, you look out. You look out and you find out what other people tell you you are. Your society, your family, and so on. You look out to find your identity. And if you want evidence of that, just think about the surnames that people often have in British culture. You might wonder why people are called things like Cook, or Baker, or Smith. And that's because your name described your job. That was your profession. If you were a cook, you cooked. If you were a baker, you baked, and so on. Your very name gave you your identity, and it told you what your vocation would be. I don't know whether this is true in every culture. I remember there was a German footballer called Bastian Schweinsteiger. I discovered that Schweinsteiger means pig climber. And I thought, that would be a very strange way to earn your bacon. Sorry, that was bad. But that would be a very strange way to earn your money, wouldn't it? Pig climber. But your name gave you your identity. And that was very much true of that culture. You were born into a certain class, into a certain society, and you were told what you would do. And it went beyond your vocation. Your life choices, the expectations of who you'd marry, when you'd marry, whether you'd have kids, how many kids, whether you'd move or stay where you are. All of those things, to a degree, were decided for you. They weren't things you chose, they were things you were born into. And that's still the case in some cultures today in other parts of the world. Now, there are certain positive things about that way of living, aren't there? I mean, it's quite simple. You don't have to worry much about what choices you're going to make in life because they're decided for you. You just do what has been mapped out for you. It's interesting, Steve Jobs, when he invented the iPhone, realized that actually sometimes people in life don't want lots of choices. So his deliberate choice was to give people a limited selection of things to choose from, because actually people sometimes prefer not having to choose. And for us, maybe it's disorientating the amount of choices we have. Much simpler to be told or expected what to do. And of course, in certain professions, it can be very helpful if skills and abilities are passed on from generation to generation, and that has certain benefits. But at the same time, there are some real downsides to that way of thinking about identity, aren't there? What if I don't want to be the thing that I'm expected to be? What if I want to be someone else? It's a fantastic film that you may or may not have seen called October Sky. And it tells the true story of a guy called Homer Hickman. He was brought up in the mid-20th century in a coal mining town in West Virginia. And because of the culture into which he was born, the expectation of his father and of his society was You will be a coal miner. That's who you will be. And yet he doesn't want to be a coal miner. He wants to be a rocket scientist. And the film shows this battle between his desires of what he feels he could be and the expectations of what his society says he should be. And amazingly, eventually he breaks free, and as the story tells, he becomes a scientist with NASA and goes on to do some incredible stuff. But that's one way of thinking about our identity. We look out to discover who we should be. But there's another way of discovering our identity, and that is the way that is predominant actually in the Western world today. And that is not to look out. In fact, it's the complete opposite. It's to look in. If you want to discover your identity and work out who you are, don't ask anyone else, just ask yourself. No one else can tell you who you're going to be. Nothing else can determine who you're going to be. You can be whoever you want to be. Your call, your choice. It's up to you. You're free. Don't look out, look in. And again, that is tremendously liberating, isn't it? Think of another film, Billy Elliot. Billy grows up also in a coal mining town in the north of England. And his dad wants him to be a boxer. But he wants to be a ballet dancer. And culture says you can't be that. But he breaks free and becomes what he wants to be. And we say, yeah, go for it, Billy. You can be who you want to be. It's a great story. Or a story close to me, story of my wife. My wife's an airline pilot. 95% of airline pilots in her company are men. In fact, if she had lived a couple of decades before, there wouldn't have been any female pilots. Because cultural expectation says, you're a woman. This is the jobs that you can do, and these are not jobs that you can do. Isn't it great? We live in a society where people can say, no, actually I don't have to be confined by the expectations and stereotypes of my gender. I can break free. I can do something different. So there's something tremendously positive, isn't there, about being able to say, look in, be who you want to be. But I also just want to ask some questions about that way of thinking as well. Firstly, can I really be anything I want to be? We're often told, you can be anything you want to be, but can I? When I was a kid, I discovered quite early on that I was flat-footed. Still am to an extent. And that meant that I was quite slow at running. I also ran with my legs kind of flailing outwards like that. And so I was a right sight, and people used to take the mick out of me. And my wife still takes the mick out of me if I try to run. I'm not very fast. And so I discovered quite quickly, despite the insults that I was given as a child, that Olympic gold medalist, sprinter, was not going to be part of my identity. Okay? No matter how much I set my heart on it, the literal makeup of my body was never going to allow me to do that. And there are certain things that we can't be, aren't there? Because we are made a certain way. Which means there are certain things we can't do. Of course, there are certain things that means we can do as well. I discovered that I was flat-footed, but I also discovered later in life I have a large lung capacity. If you need to blow up any balloons, you can come to me. But also I discovered that gave me the ability to do endurance sports. So actually, although I'm no good at running, I love cycling. I'll cycle all day. I've cycled 200 miles in a day. I've cycled 2,000 miles in a few weeks. I love cycling. That's a big part of my identity. So rather than asking the question, who do I want to be? Maybe sometimes we need to ask the question, who am I already? And what will that mean for the person I am to become? The opportunities are not infinite in that regard. Another question we might have about this idea of looking in to find our identity is this. Is it wise to ignore what anyone else says? In the past we would listen to society, to our family, to the expectations of others, but now we're told, don't listen to anyone else, just listen to yourself. Be who you want to be. But is it wise not to listen to anyone? I'll give you a scenario. Imagine I think I am going to be a great comedian, okay? And so I decide, I'm going to be a comedian. I'm going to be the next Michael McIntyre. I even got the right name, okay? And I start telling jokes, and nobody laughs. And I keep telling jokes, and everybody groans. Now, at what point do I have to say to myself, maybe I'm not actually a comedian? Or do I just say, well, doesn't matter. They don't really know me. I am a comedian, no matter what other people say. Well, I can say that, but sooner or later I'm going to be telling jokes to myself. Because part of the way we discover who we are is not just listening to our own voice, but also listening to the voices of others. And through that we discover the things that we are good at, maybe things that we're not good at. That we discover things that are good for us, and maybe we also discover things that are not good for us. And last question on this for now, and that is this. We might like to think in Western society today that we are free from society's expectations. But are we? Or have we simply replaced one set of cultural expectations for another? And we're just following along and fitting in. I'll give you an example. If you'd lived a generation or so ago and you were a woman, it would have been very culturally expected that you would give up work to have children and you would never return to work. Nowadays, that's not the case. But actually, my sister, who gave up work to have children and decided not to go back to work, has often found that that makes her seem weird because she's chosen to do something that's no longer the cultural expectation. A generation or more ago, it would have been incredibly dangerous in Western culture to reveal that you were gay. Thankfully, that's not the case today. But actually, a good friend of mine who is gay, but has chosen because of his Christian faith to remain celibate, says that actually he's faced great opposition to that choice that he's made because it doesn't fit with the cultural expectations of today. What I'm saying is that actually every culture has expectations and ways of doing things. And we might think, well, we're free, but are we really free? Or have we just changed the expectations? So look in, look out. There's positives and negatives about both, aren't there? But is there another way of discovering our identity? And I want to suggest that there is. And that is not just to look out to what others say or to look in to see what we say and feel, but ultimately to look up and think about what God might have to say about who we are. So I want us just for a few minutes before we finish to look at an encounter in the life of Jesus with a man who had built his life potentially on the wrong identity and the wrong foundation, and see how Jesus interacts with that. And these are not in the mark books that are on your table, but they are written out on a piece of paper that's on your table. So do grab them and pass them round so you can follow along with me. This is from Luke's account of the life of Jesus. Just by the way, because we're looking at segments of these accounts over the course of this week, you may have questions about why we're even doing this. Isn't this just make-believe fairy stories that have been invented and changed over 2,000 years? And what we want to say actually is that there are some really seriously good reasons for taking these accounts of the life of Jesus as genuine first century eyewitness testimony. And if you've got questions about that, then do stick them in the Slido and we can deal with them at the end. But we want to encourage you to say, look into this stuff, because this is stuff that's real history and it's worth checking out. But let's read this encounter that's written on those pages for us. It comes in Luke's account of Jesus' life, chapter 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed the sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and they began to mutter, "He's gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor, and if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. So it's a story about this guy, this short guy, called Zacchaeus. And I just wanted to notice three things that Jesus does in terms of Zacchaeus' identity. Firstly, he affirms his identity. Secondly, he challenges his identity. And thirdly, he transforms it. Very briefly. Firstly, he affirms it. You notice what the guys who look at Zacchaeus call him, the religious people around him. They call him a sinner in verse 7, if you look down there. Because they despise Zacchaeus. You might wonder, well, why did Zacchaeus have to climb a tree to see Jesus? Well, he was short. But there is another way for short people to see things going on. They just go to the front, don't they? But Zacchaeus couldn't get to the front, and I think there was a reason why he couldn't get to the front, and that is because the people in the crowd didn't like him. And there was a good reason for not liking Zacchaeus. He's a tax collector. Now, sometimes people think the 21st century equivalent of a tax collector is a traffic warden. And I think, I see what you're saying, but that's not quite getting to the heart of it. They weren't just mildly disliked, they were hated. The first 21st century equivalent of a tax collector would be a loan shark. Someone who's got rich off the misery and exploitation of the poor. And here is a guy who sided with the oppressing Romans to cheat his fellow citizens so he can get wealthy. And people hate him for it. And they say he's a sinner. And in a sense, they were right. Like, Zacchaeus had made some seriously bad choices in life. And to an extent, people's dislike of him was warranted. Sometimes in life, people's dislike of us isn't warranted. But sometimes it is. That's even harder, isn't it? Because we know actually people have good reason maybe for being upset about some of the things that we've done or the choices that we've made. So they call him a sinner. But Jesus does something really remarkable. The crowd, they don't want anything to do with Zacchaeus. They want to squeeze him out of the back. He has to climb a tree so he can see what's going on. Yet Jesus looks up at the tree, sees Zacchaeus and says, I'm coming to your house for supper. Now, in British culture, that is very rude, isn't it? If you say to someone, I'm coming to your house for tea, like, that's not done. Yeah? Like, that's quite insulting. Like, what makes you think I'm going to cook you tea? But actually, some of you from other cultures will know that actually to invite yourself to someone else's house is actually a sign of great dignity. It's to affirm someone. It's been my joy sometimes to travel to other parts of the world and to realise that actually to go to someone else's house and to receive their hospitality is a way of dignifying and affirming that person. Worked a lot in a Roma gypsy community in Eastern Europe. I always found it amazing when we went into some of the homes, incredibly poor, a sense of wonder that we would come and visit. Here is Jesus going to visit. And what is he doing? By doing that, he's saying, actually, Zacchaeus, I'm aware of the bad choices you've made in life. But I also see that you're still valuable. The crowd may have rejected you, but I am not. Because you're still precious. Because the heart of the Christian understanding is that no matter what decisions we've made in life and how much we may have messed things up, each one of us has inherent value. And that value doesn't come because of what we've done or not done, because of what we've achieved or not achieved. That value comes because of who we are. Someone said we're human beings, not human doings. Our value comes from who we are. And the Bible says we are created to reflect something of the image of God. So all of us have value and dignity. And here is Zacchaeus. And Jesus says, you're valuable. And I treat you with dignity. And actually the Christian faith says tonight, whoever you are valuable. And the God of the universe treats you with dignity. So that's the first thing, he affirms him. He affirms his inherent value. The second thing, though, is that Jesus challenges him and his identity. It's interesting, the crowd, they talked about this guy as a sinner, there in verse 7. But what does Jesus describe Zacchaeus as? Look down at verse 10, the last verse. he describes Zacchaeus as lost. Now, in a sense, the description of the crowd is true. Zacchaeus is a sinner according to the Bible's definition of the word. We all are. We've all fallen short of God's perfect standard. But Jesus doesn't just come to speak of judgment like the crowd do. He's a sinner. He also speaks of compassion. He's lost. You see, on the surface, Zacchaeus is a traitor. He's a cheat. He's not a very nice guy. But actually, those things are merely the symptoms of a deeper problem in Zacchaeus' life. See, why did Zacchaeus become so hated? Do you think Zacchaeus woke up in the morning and thought, I know what I want to do. I want to become the most hated person in my society. Do you think he did that? No, no one does that. But what he had done, it seems, is he had built his life on a dodgy foundation. And the foundation he had built it on, the identity that he had sought to build it on, was wealth. He was wealthy. And he felt, if I can find that identity, wealth, security, that'll be a foundation for my life. And of course, to achieve that identity, to gain that foundation, what does he do? Well, he ends up selling out in so many ways to get it. The poor choices that Zacchaeus makes in life happen because actually he's chosen to build his life on the wrong identity. And actually that is a problem, because all of us ultimately have to build our life on the foundation of something. David Foster Wallace was an American author, and I was really struck by something he once said in a commencement speech at a university in the US. If we can have the slide up. Thanks, guys. He said this: you get to decide what to worship. Because here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There's no such thing as not worshipping. Everyone worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. When he talks about worshipping there, he's not just talking about religious worship. He's talking about the thing that we base our life on, the centre of our identity. And he goes on and he says this: an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, you'll never have enough. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you'll always feel ugly, and when time and age start showing, you'll die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, and you'll feel weak and afraid, and you'll need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as being smart, and you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. The tragedy is that not long after saying that, David Foster Wallace took his own life. I don't know what he built his life on. But here's the thing: if we build our life on the foundation of wealth, or success, or achievements, or popularity, that's where identity is based. It's a very shaky identity. And sometimes we'll do stupid things to try and get it and keep it. Or another lighter analogy, Cool Runnings. Anyone seen Cool Runnings? If you've not seen Cool Runnings, you've got to see it. It's my pretty much my favourite film of all time. And I can happily watch it at least once a year. Cool Runnings tells the very funny story of the Jamaican bobsleigh team. That's right, the Jamaican bobsleigh team. And they go eventually to the Winter Olympics in Calgary, and I think it was 1986. And they're coached by a guy called Irv, who's played by the late John Candy. And the captain of their bobsleigh team is a guy called Derice. And eventually they end up in Calgary, and it's the night before the big bobsleigh, what do you call it? Slide, descent thing. And they're about to have the competition. But they've just discovered, or at least Derice has just discovered, that their coach, Irv, had actually been thrown out of the Olympics a number of years before for cheating, putting weights in the bobsleigh to make it go faster. And he's shocked by this. Why would he cheat? I mean, he'd already won 5 gold medals. And so the night before the competition, Derice talks to Irv in the hotel room and he says, "Boss, why did you cheat? You had 5 gold medals, you had it all." And Irv says, I had made winning my all. And when you make winning your all, you've got to win. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? You base your life on the foundation of winning. It's great, but at some point you'll do anything to keep winning. Even if it meant cheating. Even if it meant being found out. Even if it meant being rejected by the people that once respected him. But Dries is not convinced. He says, but come on, you had it all. And Irv continues, he says, a gold medal is a wonderful thing, but if you're not enough without it, you'll never be enough with it. I think that highlights the problem. What do we build our identities on? The problem for Zacchaeus is he had chosen to build his identity on something such that he was willing to do anything to get it, everything to keep it. But tragically, it screwed up his life in the process. And Jesus challenges that identity. He says, Zacchaeus, you're lost. You built your life on the wrong thing. So he affirms, he challenges, and then lastly, he transforms his identity. They go off, they have dinner, or lunch, or whatever they had at Zacchaeus' house. And then Zacchaeus comes out, and he announces to the crowd, who are so amazed by this. Look again at verse 8. Look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. I've cheated anybody out of anything. I'll pay them back 4 times. There's a remarkable turnaround in this man's life, in the way that he's living. But why? Well, because now he's got a new identity. Look at verse 9. Jesus said, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. Now to us, that phrase, son of Abraham, may not mean very much. But actually to Zacchaeus, it would have meant a lot. Because Zacchaeus had felt rejected by his own people, the Jews, for the way that he had lived, for the decisions that he had made. He felt, I'm no longer a son of Abraham. I'm no longer part of God's people. But Jesus says, actually, I've come so that you can be included in God's people. That term, son of Abraham, was a term of acceptance, of dignity. Jesus says, I've come so that people like you, who feel rejected, who've made the wrong choices, can be included. So you can have a new identity. And that's actually what Jesus wants to offer to each one of us too. The identity of saying or being God's son. Knowing that the God of the universe loves us, accepts us, includes us. And ultimately that is incredible. It's incredible because of what it costs. It cost ultimately Jesus to lose his acceptance with God the Father so that we could get it. The story of Jesus' life goes on that ultimately he is strung up on a Roman cross. He's crucified, and in agony he faces rejection so that we can be accepted. He's abandoned so that we can be welcomed. So that we can know God's acceptance, and so that we can build our life on that foundation. Now what does that look like, you might say, as we finish? To build your life, to build your identity on the foundation of the acceptance of God. It doesn't mean that other things in your life have no importance. As I said at the beginning, there's lots of things that make up my identity. My age, my marital status, my profession, my interests, my hobbies. They're all part of who I am. And they don't become unimportant the moment I become a follower of Jesus. But actually they become less important compared to the most important thing. And that is to say that the foundation, the centre of my identity, is now based on the fact that I'm accepted by the God of the universe and loved by him. And I want to say that is wonderful. Why? Firstly, because it gives you great stability. See, if you build your life on the foundation of anything else, you may or may not get it. But even if you get it, you'll be crippled with fear of losing it. Because the reality in life is that the longer we live, so many of our aspects of our lives that give us our identity are stripped away from us. We may lose our jobs through redundancy or ultimately retirement. We may lose the relationships that we enjoy through breakdown or death. All these things that are so precious to us won't last, will they? So my wife's an airline pilot, and like many of her colleagues, for most of lockdown, she wasn't flying. And there was a great uncertainty for many of them whether they would lose their jobs. That was a really hard time for her. for a number of our colleagues, it wasn't just a hard time, it was a debilitating time. Because their profession was their identity. And the possibility of losing that identity felt shattering. It wasn't easy being a Christian and going through that for my wife, but it was easier because the foundation hadn't been taken away, and that was never in threat. So it gives you stability, but the last thing I'd say is this: it also gives you great freedom, because it gives you freedom to explore the other aspects of your identity in friendship with God, and to explore the kind of person that God has made you. Because you are unique. And God has given you certain abilities, physical, mental, natural, and they form who you are. And one of the great adventures of living the Christian life and following Jesus is discovering the person that God has created you to be. And then becoming increasingly the person that He's created you to be. Now, I don't know what you think of this, what I've said. In a moment, we're going to have questions. And so do be writing your questions. You may be here saying, well, actually, I'm not even sure this is true. This talk about God, it sounds a little bit like a psychological crutch to me, and I'm not convinced. And if that's what you're thinking, can I say thank you so much for coming. It's great that you're here. Do ask questions. We'd love to hear what your questions or objections might be. But we also want to say, as I mentioned earlier, we don't think this is just a psychological crutch, because we think it's actually based on a solid foundation, on the life, death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, for which there is really good evidence, which we'd encourage you to check out. And one of the best places to start is actually those books that are on your tables called Uncover. Why not take those away and have a read? I had a friend who was a very convinced, sceptical atheist as a student, and then someone gave him one of those books, and the problem was, when he got to the end of it, he wasn't such a sceptical atheist anymore, and he ultimately became a Christian. So actually, it's a very dangerous book to read, because it may challenge your worldview. But I dare you, why not give it a read, see what you think of it. Maybe you're saying, well, actually, I've got all sorts of questions about how this works. I'm not sure what this looks like. There's terminology and concepts here that I've not thought about before. And we'd love you to keep on looking into this. You know, if what we are saying this week has a chance of being true, even just a chance, wouldn't it be worth looking into more? And so keep coming this week, sign up for the follow-up and for the other things that will be happening after this week. Check it out. But maybe actually some of you are here and saying, actually, I think this could be true. And actually I realise that to discover the acceptance of God and to build my life on the foundation of the identity that I can have in Him would actually be a wonderful, stabilising and liberating thing. And the wonderful thing is you can experience that. And if you'd like to experience that, why not talk to this God? Ask Him to forgive you for the stuff in your life that's wrong, for the way that you built your life on the wrong foundation. Ask Him to come into your life so that you might know His acceptance, His love, His welcome. And then ask Him for His help to start building your life on that foundation. And if you do that, then let someone know. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a few minutes break, and you can put your questions on Slido, 194972. But also, it'd be really great if you could take a moment just to fill out the feedback forms that are on your tables or on your chairs. They look like this, and we'd love to know what you thought of the events tonight and the events this week. So just take a moment now. It'd be great if everyone could do this. So just scribble some comments about the evening. You can say, I prefer the speaker that was on at 6 or something like that. You could say, well, you know, your clothes are a lot less interesting than his. Whatever you like. But also, there are some boxes there, or some circles rather, to say keep connected. Count me in is the first one. If you're saying, actually, I'd like to know how to discover this relationship with God, how to become a follower of Jesus. What's involved in that? How do I get started? Tick the first circle, count me in. If you're saying, I've got questions, I'd like to look into this more, I'm not convinced yet, but I want to explore this. Tick the second box, and some lovely member of the Christian Union will give you a call tomorrow, and they'll offer to meet up for a coffee, and we can discuss these things further. Or maybe you'd like to find out what else the Christian Union are putting on. Tick the third box. But of course, if you put any of those things, also put your name and your number so that we'll be able to get in touch with you. Okay? So a couple of minutes to write your questions, to fill out your feedback forms, to grab another coffee, and then we'll get back for 10 minutes or so to look at those questions. Thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We hope you are enjoying your chats and enjoying your coffees. Thank you so much for all the questions you sent in on Slido. We have had a huge response. It's really exciting reading these through. But now's the time you've been waiting for. We are going to pose these questions to Michael and really see the Christian take on these answers. So Michael, kicking us off, why Jesus? Why not base our lives on some other religious or philosophical identity, such as Marxism?
Yeah, good question. So why would you adopt Christianity? Why would you adopt the Christian faith? Well, I guess, in a sense, that's what we're trying to answer all week. And one of the ways we're trying to answer it is to say that actually we're convinced that Christianity makes best sense of the things that matter most. So in terms of our identity, it gives us the most secure foundation for our identity. Or if we're looking at lunchtime in terms of anxiety and stress, then actually it gives us the best way to discover real, lasting, deep peace. So it gives us the best foundation. It seems to make best sense of the things that matter most in life. So that's kind of an existential way of answering that question. And to do that, of course, you need to look at the things that matter to you and then look at what the Christian faith has to say in response to it and compare it. You know, how does the Christian faith compare with what other worldviews and philosophies speak? And one of the things that I've been amazed and impressed by again and again as I look at the life and teaching of Jesus is how it seems to make best sense of these things, works. But also, we want to say, why Jesus? Because I think there's a kind of objective way of saying that Christianity is true in a way that other worldviews and philosophies cannot be shown to be true. And that's an interesting question, isn't it? How do you know whether a religion, a worldview, or a philosophy is true? Well, often it's very difficult to know, because if you're going to say something is objectively true, you've got also to be able to say that it was, at least in theory, going to be falsifiable. There'd be a way of showing that it wasn't true. And a lot of worldviews and belief systems are not falsifiable because the nature of the claims that they make just are different. I could say, you know, like tonight I go home, I have a dream, and God reveals himself to me in a dream, and I'm going to tell the world tomorrow all the new teachings that I've revealed from being received from God. But how would you know whether that was true? How would you know whether that really happens? There's no way that you could falsify my claim because there's no way you can investigate it. But the heart of the Christian faith is not just an idea, it's an event. It's Jesus' life, death and resurrection 2,000 years ago in history. An event that either happened or didn't happen, and an event that you can investigate by looking into the historical evidence for it. And I would say that stands out as different. Now, I'm not saying that other religions don't make historical claims. Of course, Islam makes the claim that Muhammad was a prophet, received the words of Allah in a cave, and so on. Again, very difficult to verify by any other source those claims. But when it comes to the claims of Jesus' life, death, and in particular his resurrection, they are claims that I think we can verify in a different way. So it sets itself up for critical investigation. And that's what many people have done, and that's what we'd invite you to do.
On a similar note of claims, this one's really focused on miracles. So why believe the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' supposed miracles any more than those of any other religious supposed miracles?
Yeah, so lots of religions make claims of the miraculous, and if we live in the Western world, and we've been brought up in this generation and this culture, we're trained to be incredibly sceptical of probably all claims to the miraculous. And to a degree, you know, I can understand that. I'm also the product of this culture. And a degree of skepticism can be quite helpful to actually question stuff. But actually, like I'd say, in answer to the earlier question, I think there are some really good reasons for taking the accounts of Jesus' life really seriously. To give you one comparison, the Quran doesn't really record miraculous events of the life of Muhammad. If we want to look at the events of the life of Muhammad, we need to look at the biographies of the life of Muhammad. One of the interesting comparisons is that the earliest biography of the life of Muhammad is from a couple of 100 years after his life. So we're talking about not a source written by contemporaries or eyewitnesses, but a source that's written much later. One of the things that strikes me about the Mark's Gospels that are on our tables is that however you date it, whether you go conservative or kind of, you know, less conservative, everyone would say it's a it's an account that is written within the generation of the life of Jesus' followers. So it's written at a time when people could actually corroborate or deny the kind of claims that were being made. And also, it was an account that was making incredible claims that had no chance, from a human point of view, of taking off. Because Christianity had no political power. There was no natural reason why anyone would want to adopt the Christian faith and start believing these claims. It wouldn't get you to power, it normally got you killed, or at least ostracized. So you have to ask the question, why, when it was so easily falsifiable in theory, did so many become so convinced by it and were willing to suffer so greatly for it? And again, that is potentially different to other worldviews, where there might have been more reasons for wanting to accept the claims being made from the outset. Now I know 300 years later Christianity did become equated with political power, but the interesting thing is for 300 years after Jesus, people believe this stuff in the face of strong opposition based on these claims that are being made.
So we've heard about other faiths, we've heard about other perspectives and other religious leaders. How do we know the Christian God is the only God?
Yeah, again, it's very popular, isn't it, to say, all routes lead to God, doesn't matter which religion you follow. Although, of course, the strange thing about that is, of course, not every religion believes in a singular God, not every religion believes in any God at all. So it's often disingenuous to the actual claims and beliefs of each religious system to say that kind of thing. It's often the kind of thing that secular Western people say, as opposed to people of a particular religious belief. How do we know that the Christian God is the real God? I do find it fascinating that every culture in the world has some sense of the supernatural, some sense of belief. There's never been a purely atheistic society, ever. They tried it in places like Albania during communism, and they gave it a good go, and it failed. It's in Albania recently, and the Christian church is growing quite rapidly there. But it doesn't seem to work. Why? Because it seems that at the heart of humanity is this searching for something beyond ourselves and something outside of the natural order that we live in. I think the difference with the Christian faith is, whereas I might define religion as our attempt to try and search out what God might be like, the Christian faith is God's revelation to us of what he is like. So it's not us trying to discover what God is like, but God revealing himself and doing it actually in person. So the Christian claim, the claim of the Bible, is that in Jesus, God didn't simply send a prophet or a teacher to tell us about who he is. God came in person, revealing himself. So as we encounter Jesus of Nazareth, we're encountering what God is really like. And we see in his life, death, and resurrection something of God's character and something of who he's like. Now that's not to say that everything that every religious belief in the world claims is wrong. But it does mean that if God has ultimately revealed himself to me in Jesus, that is the standard by which I'm to discover what real truth is. And that's the ultimate basis that I'm going to go back to.
Thank you. We've had a couple more coming in on identity. Some similar ones, so if we merge them, I apologise. Do ask Michael at the end if you have a specific question related to that. But how much of one's identity is a consequence of their surroundings? Does this then justify bad behaviour?
That's a really good question. Because one of the things that we're increasingly aware of is the person we have become is influenced, isn't it, by the society that we live in, by the parents that we have, by the people around us, by the card that we've been dealt with, if you want to use that analogy in life. And actually, we can't ignore that. Like, that is true. Like, part of who I am is caused by things outside of my control that I didn't decide. But there's a subtle but major difference between saying I am influenced by factors outside of my control and saying I am nothing more than the sum of factors outside of my control. And actually, it's a very dehumanizing thing to say that all of the things that I do are simply the result of my genetics or my environment, ultimately. But it's something we like to do, don't we? Particularly when we do things wrong. When we do things wrong, we're quick to say, but it wasn't really me, it was my parents. Or it wasn't really me, it was just like my upbringing. Have you ever noticed when people do things good, they don't do that? So when someone wins Olympic gold, and someone says, you did so well, they don't say, just happen to have really good genes. No, they probably did have good genes. They didn't have flat feet like me anyway. But they also worked incredibly hard. There was a combination of factors outside of their control and factors within their control. And I think the reality is we're a combination of both. There are some things we can't change, but that's not to say there aren't anything we can't change. And it's a tremendously liberating thing to realise actually that we do have real choices in terms of the people we become. And that has a positive side, because it means that we can be credited for the good things that we do, but it has a negative side, doesn't it? It means we're also responsible for the bad things that we do. Thankfully, it's not the end of the story, because the Christian faith says even at that point, there is a God who's willing to forgive us for those choices that we've made and give us a fresh start.
Thank you. Well, you've mentioned identity, and you've mentioned some of the risks of identity. If one places their identity in the Christian faith, doesn't this just place many expectations on them? Perhaps ideas or actions they feel they must embody as a Christian.
So we put like our identity from our career or whatever into the Christian faith. I think, and you would say basically that's just taking it from one shaky foundation that seems insecure to another one. I think it depends what you understand being a Christian to be. So often our understanding of being a Christian is living up to a certain list of expectations, ticking a list of living the Christian life in the right way, and that means that I'm now accepted by God. I'm accepted by God because I do the right things. That's not what a Christian is. The Bible says a Christian is someone who has come to discover the free forgiveness and acceptance of God because of what Jesus has done for them on the cross. Not because of what we've done, in spite of what we've done. And that is the foundation of what it is to be a Christian. And out of that acceptance, of course, it does change our life. We want to live differently, and it will change our lives for the better. It won't always be easy. But the foundation is God's free acceptance of us. And that's really, really important, because if the foundation of your Christian life was living a good Christian life, well, some days you might feel you've done it well, some days you might feel you've done it badly. And that will be just as shaky as building it on your career, your studies, or anything else. But if it's built on the foundation of a God who loves you no matter what, that is something that's really, really secure.
It certainly is a secure foundation. And the next question that came in is straight about that. Is faith really a solid foundation? If the teachings of the Bible, they are beautiful, they're insightful, but if Jesus isn't the Son of God, doesn't that firm foundation break?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you might as well take the tent down now. Seriously, I mean, that might sound surprising to say, because a lot of people say, well, I kind of like the ideas and teachings of Jesus. Thomas Jefferson famously once had his own version of the Bible where he cut out all the bits he didn't like and just kept the bits he did. And actually the reality is, if you take out that foundation of Jesus' identity, it falls apart. Why? I remember having a conversation with a guy once. We were sitting in a cafe, and he said, well, I like to think Jesus was a good teacher. He had some good things to say. I don't think he was the Son of God. He's a good teacher. I said, okay, can I read to you one of his teachings? He said, okay, sure. So we opened up John's account of Jesus' life, and I read this thing that Jesus said. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to God except through me. And this guy looked at me, and his kind of mouth drops open, and he was like, what? I said, what do you mean? He says, it's a very arrogant thing to say, isn't it? I said, well, yeah, it is, isn't it? Like, if I was to say that, it's a very, very arrogant thing to say. And what he came to realise is that actually, if Jesus isn't who he claims to be, actually his teachings no longer become good teachings. Because he's making claims that are egotistical and arrogant. But of course, if he is who he claims to be, the God of the universe who created everything, and he becomes a human being, steps into planet Earth, lives as one of us, how incredibly humble for someone to do that. So actually it is built on that foundation. I'd say that's why that question is a fundamental one that we need to look at. That's why I'd really encourage you to read through those Uncover books and to ask that question for yourself.
Penultimate question, and it's about these teachings of Jesus. Why did the people in these stories convert at the very first sight of Jesus? Why did they not have to wait to hear what he said? What was so good about him, I suppose?
Yeah, that's a really insightful question, because it shows that you were looking at that passage. I mean, Zacchaeus, Jesus comes in, and without any further ado, bam, his life is transformed. Now, of course, Luke, who writes this account of Jesus' life, doesn't necessarily tell us everything that happens. We don't know what happens as Jesus went into the house. We just know that when Jesus and Zacchaeus came out of the house, Zacchaeus was a changed man. I'm sure they did talk, okay? What they talked about, I don't know. But clearly there was an encounter. And clearly for Zacchaeus, that encounter was quite dramatic and quite quick. And for some people that is true. I've met people who had no thought of Jesus. They came to an event like this. They heard a talk like this. They said, I think this makes sense. I'm going to start building my life on the foundation of Jesus. And like that, life has changed. Of course, they don't understand everything, but they understood enough to say, here's someone that I want to build my life on. Here's someone I want to follow. And that understanding grew. But actually, if you read through Mark's Gospel, you'll realise that Zacchaeus is not typical of how everyone comes to Jesus. And in fact, the disciples of Jesus, the guys who go on to become the leaders of the Christian movements, are actually quite dissimilar to Zacchaeus in some ways, because it takes them like 3 years to get who Jesus is. And you can see that they're really, really slow. And so often Jesus is like, do you not get it yet? And I find great encouragement in that, because if you come to this stuff and you say, oh, it doesn't all make sense at once, and it does seem a bit confusing, you're not the odd one out. As you read through the Gospels, you realise there are people like you as well, and for some of us it takes time, and that's okay. Keep asking, keep looking into it. There's no such thing as a stupid question, and we'd love to help you in that journey.
Before we answer our last question, there are a couple more in there that keep coming in, all moderately interlinked with ones we've answered. If your question has a slightly different point that we're not interpreting, please do find Michael. You're here all week. We'd be more than happy to discuss.
Sure.
But for our final question, and this is really Jesus and identity. How do you find your identity in Jesus when it feels like you've lost your identity and you've lost your sense of who you are?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know who you are who's asked the question and what's happened to make you feel that you've lost that. I guess, because I don't know who you are, I guess I can try and answer it in two different ways. One is maybe, as we said at the beginning, university is quite a disorientating time. And in a way, sometimes we feel that our identity is being stripped away. Who am I now? As I've come away from my family, from the things that were stable, who am I going to be? How is building your life on Jesus having a secure foundation? Well, I think it's two things. One is to say that it's the centre of our identity and it will not change. So whatever else changes in life, if you build your life on the love and acceptance of God, that is something that will stay constant through life. It's tremendously liberating and gives you great security. But as we said earlier, it also gives you the freedom to ask the question, God, if you actually made me, I'm not just the random result of an accidental process, but as the Bible says, God, you wanted me to be, then who do you want me to be? And what abilities have you given me? And what things have you given me? We talked about the things that we didn't choose. Our bodies, our natural abilities, our intellectual abilities, our personalities, our temperaments, our culture, our families, and so on. All of them form, to a degree, who we are. And then we say, actually, God, this isn't necessarily by accident. So how does that help me to become the person you want me to be? And that's one of the beautiful things about being a Christian. It's about being in relationship with the God who made you. And it means that actually He can help you discover that identity. And it doesn't all happen at once. It's a process. And it's an adventure, discovering that. The other way of looking at it might be to say that actually, for some people, becoming a follower of Jesus is quite a disorientating thing. Because actually certain aspects that we have built our identity on are stripped away. And it is a reorientating of our identity. And it may feel actually we're losing quite a lot to become a follower of Jesus. And some people, particularly if you come from a different religious or cultural background, might really feel that keenly if you're exploring the Christian faith and what it might mean to embrace it. All I would say is that you're not alone. actually, in the history of the last 2,000 years of the Christian church, your experience is far more normative than any other. And actually, if you read through the Uncover books, you'll see that actually for many of the people who first became followers of Jesus, actually it was also quite a disorientating and scary thing to do. And yet they discovered two things. They discovered that what they found in Jesus was far greater than what they lost when they started to follow Jesus. And they also discovered that they would miss out on far more if they didn't follow Jesus than if they did. And so I think it's worth it, even if it can seem like a pretty scary thing to do. And it is. It's a radical thing to do. It was for Zacchaeus, it would be for us. But actually it's a wonderful choice to make. Can I just say, if you want to ask other questions, do come and grab me at the end. Also, if you are thinking about that choice and what that would involve, I've got some little booklets called Yes, written by a friend of mine, who actually a few years ago came and spoke here in Warwick with me, the last time I was here in Warwick. But Michael Green wrote this little helpful booklet designed to help anyone who's thinking about saying yes to building their life on the foundation of Jesus and coming to know that relationship we talked about. If you'd like one of those, I'd love to give one to you. Just grab me at the end, metaphorically, and I will give you one, okay? So I'll be wandering around, just grab one of the booklets, it'll explain a bit more about what's involved in that. It'd be great to give one to you. Thanks.
Can we show our appreciation of Michael?